The history of weaponry is generally divided into two massive eras: the long-lasting age of melee weapons, which spans thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years if we count the Stone Age, and the much shorter era of firearms. But, as is often the case, everything seems simple and clear-cut until you start digging deeper. So today, without unnecessary fluff, I'll share my take on the development of handheld firearms and one not-so-obvious reason why melee weapons disappeared. To avoid getting lost in the history of gunpowder and early cannons, let's start in the 15th century. This is when relatively light matchlock muzzle-loading firearms called arquebuses first appeared, weighing around 3 kilograms. By the latter half of the 15th century, they saw their first large-scale use, for example, during the Burgundian Wars. However, they didn't spark any major revolution. For most of the 15th century, knightly armor continued evolving primarily as protection against melee weapons. The next key development came in the 1520s with the arrival of the musket, and of course, the musketeers. This was a powerful weapon, weighing between 8 and 9 kilograms, which was heavier than a two-handed sword or an average modern crowbar. It had an overall length of about 1.5 meters, a caliber of over 20 millimeters, and a bullet weighing around 50 grams. The musket was inaccurate, slow, and heavy, but very powerful. Despite proving its effectiveness in battles like Pavia, where it wreaked havoc on the French heavy cavalry, several important factors should be kept in mind. In the 16th century, only about 1/6 of soldiers on European battlefields carried firearms. It wasn't until the late 16th and early 17th centuries that gunmen outnumbered those armed solely with melee weapons. At the same time, muskets had a painfully slow rate of fire, 1 to 2 shots per minute at best. This meant that by the time a soldier had reloaded, enemy cavalry could cover more than 500 meters at full gallop. As a result, from the 15th to the late 17th century, firearms were not self-sufficient weapons. Musketeers were typically equipped with additional melee weapons like bardiches or Swedish feathers, or they were directly supported by pikemen. In short, early handheld firearms still required melee weapons to be effective in battle. However, by the 1640s, an interesting innovation started gaining traction: the bayonet. Essentially, this was a dagger inserted into the muzzle of a musket. The idea of combining firearms with melee weapons was solid, but the execution left much to be desired. The bayonet blocked the barrel, making it impossible to fire, sometimes got stuck in the musket, or even remained in the enemy's body after a strike. On top of that, the sheer weight of the musket made hand-to-hand combat impractical. But things changed at the turn of the 18th century when lighter muskets replaced the older models. These new firearms were nearly half the weight of their predecessors, around 4.5 kilograms, and came with full metal socket bayonets that slid over the barrel. France, the German principalities, and Denmark began adopting the socket bayonet in 1689-1690, while Russia introduced it in 1702. Attaching a full dagger to the barrel would have been a bad idea since muskets were muzzle-loaded and soldiers could easily cut themselves while reloading. Additionally, bayonets needed to be as light as possible while remaining strong and preventing them from getting stuck in an opponent's body. The solution was the needle bayonet, a round or multi-edged steel spike. These bayonets were typically about 50 centimeters long and weighed no more than 400 grams. At the time, muskets were around 1.5 meters in length, and with a bayonet attached, the weapon reached nearly 2 meters. In essence, an infantryman was now armed with the equivalent of a spear, capable of reaching cavalrymen as well. Cavalry remained a serious threat throughout the smoothbore muzzle-loader era, but the bayonet served multiple purposes. One often overlooked aspect was psychological. Even if a soldier ran out of ammunition or their powder got wet, they no longer felt defenseless. Additionally, bayonets weren't just for close combat. They were also used to finish off wounded enemies and escort prisoners. Many attribute the disappearance of pikemen and much of the melee arsenal in the 18th century to the growing effectiveness of firearms. But in reality, it wasn't just firearms that buried melee weapons, it was the bayonet. Combined with a lighter firearm, it created a hybrid weapon system effective for both ranged and melee combat, securing infantry's dominance on the battlefield. The famous Russian general Alexander Suvorov once said, "A bullet is a fool, but a bayonet is a fine fellow," implying that bullets could be wasted, while a bayonet could quickly take down multiple opponents in the right hands. However, in context, his words were more about conserving ammunition. In large-scale campaigns, logistics and supply issues were always a concern, making the bayonet a crucial backup weapon. That said, According to historian Dimitri Tselarungo, cold weapons accounted for no more than 7% of casualties during the Battle of Borodino. But here's an interesting detail. A report from General Larry Boissier to the French Emperor noted that over 2 million shots were fired during that battle. Based on total casualties, enthusiasts estimate that the average French infantryman had to fire more than 20 times to land a single hit. Over 70% of soldiers never hit anyone at all. The accuracy of gunfire was around 2%. It's also worth mentioning the experiments conducted at the Austrian Arms Museum in Graz. Researchers took 11 muzzle-loading rifles dating from the late 16th to the mid-18th century, fixed them in place, and set up full-size targets at 100 meters. Even under these ideal conditions, the most accurate models only hit the target about 50% of the time. Now, if we also consider that by the 19th century, the maximum rate of fire in battle had only increased to 4 rounds per minute and was often much lower, then situations where soldiers engaged in close combat were not exactly routine, but weren't all that rare either. The importance of the bayonet is indirectly demonstrated by the fact that infantry numbers were counted not by the number of rifles, but by the number of bayonets. In combat, the narrow, elongated bayonet tip caused small but very deep wounds, often sealing at the surface, leading to internal bleeding and blood pooling in the body. Soldiers primarily aimed for the abdomen, not necessarily to kill instantly, but because a gut wound was enough to put an enemy out of action. And just to be clear, claims about the inhumanity of certain bayonet designs are mostly speculative. All needle bayonets inflicted similar wounds, regardless of how many edges they had. And back then, humanitarian concerns weren't exactly a priority. There were no bans on 3-edged, 4-edged, or any other multi-edged bayonets. Needle bayonets remained in use well into the mid-20th century, and China, as far as we know, still has them in service today. However, if we're talking about the combination of a firearm with a fixed bayonet, forming a hybrid weapon, then while it emerged at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, it became obsolete by the mid-19th century. Several key innovations led to this shift. In the 1770s, building on earlier developments, the Ferguson breech-loading rifle was introduced. This was a firearm that no longer needed to be loaded from the muzzle. Its moment of glory would come in the 19th century, alongside the widespread adoption of self-contained cartridges and rifled barrels. By the mid-19th century, these advancements gave rise to a new type of weapon, the rifle. One of the first successful models was the Dry's needle gun, adopted in 1841. It had a firing rate of up to 12 rounds per minute, which was revolutionary for its time. The first breech-loading rifle adopted by the Russian Empire in 1867, the Krunka, was also based on a Prussian design. It was later replaced by the American Berdan rifle, which in turn was succeeded in 1891 by the famous Mosin rifle, incorporating elements from the Belgian Nagant brothers. But back to the topic. In the second half of the 19th century, a new, faster-firing, self-sufficient type of firearm emerged. Along with it came large and imposing bayonet swords. To be fair, some bladed bayonets had been used earlier as well. Since firearms were no longer muzzle-loaded, there was no longer a risk of injuring oneself while reloading. However, despite their intimidating appearance, these bayonet swords actually symbolized the decline of close combat. Large knives and cleavers had always been part of a soldier's kit, mostly serving as everyday tools. Now, the needle bayonet, which had almost always remained fixed to the rifle, was replaced by a detachable bayonet sword. But due to their size and weight, such bayonets were only fixed just before use. Since the bayonet was now just a modified version of a soldier's standard blade, this also helped cut down on overall equipment costs. But more importantly, it meant that firearms were no longer always ready for melee combat. The bayonet shifted from being an essential weapon to a backup option. Later developments in the 20th century transformed the bayonet sword into a shorter, less effective bayonet knife for close-quarters combat. That said, countries that placed a strong emphasis on bayonet fighting, like the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, were in no rush to adopt bayonet swords. Needle bayonets were still widely used in World War I and World War II. Interestingly, even in the age of rifled firearms, a needle bayonet mounted on the right side of the barrel helped reduce bullet drift caused by rotational spin. Overall, I'd say the period from the early 18th to the mid-19th century was the true era of hybrid weaponry, when the bayonet was a vital and nearly constant companion to firearms. As I mentioned earlier, this seems to be the key reason why so many medieval melee weapons faded into obscurity, though cavalry did retain some of them. The age of fully effective firearms truly began in the latter half of the 19th century with the rise of rifles. Today, many armies around the world have abandoned bayonets, and their role in combat has nearly vanished. But in the grand scheme of things, the bayonet can be seen as a crutch that helped firearms secure their dominance on the battlefield. For much of the modern era, the real ruling force wasn't purely firearms, but rather hybrid weapons.